hymn for worship number 22.
All right, it's been a while. So what we're going to do is go right back into Numbers chapter 14, and I'll do my best not to get stuck in the first 19 verses, but we do need to review and refresh ourselves. Just a couple of things. If you had not already picked up the material in the back several weeks ago, and you picked it up today, it is new material for you. But some of you probably already had it. It's just been a while. And so if you did already have it, I would say to you that we didn't finish it. So like the second half of that material, we haven't covered yet. So if you have that, you're in good shape. And if not, you can get some after Bible class and that kind of thing. So Numbers chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14. A very important section. This is one of those sections in Numbers that is, and we've talked about this, but I just want to remind you, that's used or referenced on several occasions in the New Testament. And so one of the things that I do appreciate, because so many of you have been very encouraging about studying the book of Numbers, and I know on the front end, in those first few chapters, you kind of go, okay, this, I'm struggling here a little bit, but once you understand, as we studied, why all the organization language, why the plan and the pattern and all of that as they're going to the promised land, just remember that much of the New Testament is either a direct quotation from the Old Testament or an allusion to events from the Old Testament, okay? Not only that, Numbers, surprisingly for probably many of us, has a number of sections that are actually being referenced in the New Testament, sometimes even surprising kinds of things. So for instance, we studied the priestly blessing, that we even have a hymn that is based on those verses in Numbers. That's referenced in Psalms, even within the Old Testament. You see it referencing back to Numbers. When Jesus talks about, looking at him and trusting in him, you remember the serpent on the cross? We hadn't gotten there yet, but he's going to talk about that in John 3, and you might read John 3 and go, okay, what is this? You got to go back to Numbers. And especially the section we're in right now, Numbers chapters 13 and 14, regarding that first generation not being faithful and therefore not being able to go into the promised land. You have that alluded to and referenced quite specifically and explicitly in Hebrews. You have it in 1 Corinthians 10. Those are all admonitions to Christians, okay? So when you You know, when you're looking at Numbers, think of it in light of the whole of God's revelation. And so what we're looking at, even though most of us are probably pretty familiar with Numbers 13 and 14, as we're reading and we're studying and we're discussing, this has application to us. Romans 15 and verse 4 says, whatever things were written aforetime, and that's talking about the Old Testament, were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. So that's all really important. Just want to encourage you in that as we kind of re-enter into this study. So when we looked at Numbers chapter 13, how many spies were sent? 12. So what were they doing? Why were they sent? And we might say scouts, you know.
We were to spy out the land.
Okay, you got me surprised here. Okay. What'd you say, Roger?
They were sent to spy out the land to see how, what was there. Was the land good? What kind of enemy? I won't say enemy, but the people that lived there that would end up being enemies to some extent. Yeah. What were they facing? Yeah, right. Exactly. What were you going to say, Mike? Same thing. Okay, that was accurate. So, okay. So, God obviously knows, but He wants them to come back with this report. Now, interestingly, who were the two witnesses that come back with a good report? Joshua and Caleb, and we'll talk more about them today. They come back with a good report, and we talked a lot about this, but your perspective when you have faith in God versus your perspective when you're trusting in yourself is entirely different. And so the majority of the spies come back and they're saying, hey, yeah, there's some good stuff over there. I mean, they're coming back with grapes and they're huge. The food is abundant. And there's even places to live. They're not even going to have to build their own homes. I mean, it's ready in many ways, but there's also the adversary. And it does seem, without the Lord's help, it seems very formidable. And what we're going to find out is without the Lord's help, they would never be able to overcome. But the Lord has helped them. He delivered them from Egypt. He's the same God that has offered salvation, and over and over and over, He has demonstrated His patience, His faithfulness, and all of that. And so really, it's an opportunity for them to go over there, see the blessings of God, and also show trust in God, that they spiritually have matured and that they're trusting in God. Now, leading up to that, the pattern we have seen from them would not indicate that the majority of people were trusting in God as they should. And so you can almost see, and one thing I would mention to you is a lot of the times when we have major failures in life, there's probably been things leading up to that. And you see that in Israel that seemed small at the time from their standpoint, but God is taking very seriously because it indicates a pattern that's going to end up being destructive. Okay. Alan, what were you going to say?
I think, to your point, God knew the giants were in the land. I mean, He knew it was a great land. Many places that were far better than where they were. I think, to your point, the testing and proving of their faith. But those giants, it was a way, I guess, maybe for God to say, okay, I'm going to weed out the ones.
Right, yeah. You're right, that's a good point. It is a pruning, kind of a separation of those who believe and those who don't. And in this case, the majority of the spies or scouts that went over there end up failing that test. And in many ways were representative of much of Israel. But you still have a remnant. Now this is an important point all the way through the Old Testament coming to the New Testament. You still have that remnant that's hanging on, that's serving God, that's faithful. So just because they're not the majority doesn't mean that they're not right with God. They are. Roger, what were you going to say?
Generation, the Hebrews that were with them, they had not seen what God had done in Egypt.
Going back to Egypt.
So they don't have, they have the history, but they haven't seen God in action for them as much as, I need the Joshua and Caleb either for Or is that they had faith?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking it hasn't been if you actually look at the time, I know what you mean, but I mean, it's not, it feels long because but it's not been that long since Exodus 19 and the mountain and that kind of thing. We're only 2 or 3 years out. So they should have known better. What's interesting, though, to that point is that the second generation that's going to come on, actually, they are going to trust God, and they are going to be faithful to God, at least to enter into the land of Canaan. So it is significant, I think, because Joshua had been Moses' assistant that whole time. And he continues to be faithful to Moses. So this is another case of just their lack of faith. And remember what they said. They wanted to go back to where? Egypt. So they remembered Egypt. They wanted to go back where they had the diet and all this and had all that selective memory. They didn't talk about slavery in Egypt and death in Egypt and suffering in Egypt. They didn't talk about all of that. So let's get back into Exodus chapter 14. We're coming out of chapter 13. You'll notice the spies come back and give their reports. When they go over there, they see the Nephilim, these major giants. Verse 33, they said, we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sight. Verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us. There you see the lack of faith. Later on, we'll read about, you think about 1 Samuel and David and Goliath and that kind of thing, and they're doing what Israel does sometimes. If you look at verse 30, Caleb, and this will be significant as we move through, Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it. I mean, just completely different viewpoint. I will say, sometimes people ask why Caleb. Caleb is very vocal here. And I think it's a fair point to be made, and several have made it, that it may well be Caleb was in a better position to do this. Now, he was a pretty outspoken, strong man. You have to remember Joshua, who's he closely associated with? Moses. So you have this friction. Now, Joshua was a faithful witness too, but Caleb, being the one that led that opposition to the majority consensus, it's important, and it shows the level of trust and faith that he has. Alan, did you have something?
I was talking about the giants. You referenced the giants. They also say the land is a land that devours its inhabitants. Do we know what that is referring to?
I don't. I could look it up probably and spend some time. What verse is that?
32.
Okay, let's read it. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone in spying it out is a land that devoured its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw are men of great size. There may be more to it. It seems to me that land is being used there not for literal land, but for the people that occupy it. So he's probably saying that the people that occupy it just devour whoever comes into that territory. I don't know any other way to look at it. I mean, you could go deeper than that and talk about the fact that it is a flourishing land, and therefore it's a very, people are carnal and competitive and want those blessings. But it seems to me he's just describing those who, because, he mentions giants right at the end of that. So maybe what he's saying is, because often, and this is an important point when you're reading the Bible and it talks about land, often it's talking about those who occupy the land. Go ahead, Daryl.
The bad report was greatly exaggerated.
Yeah.
They really weren't like grasshoppers.
Right.
Those people may have been 8 or 9 feet tall, and there's certainly not a whole lot of difference in a 6-foot guy. That's not like a grasshopper to a man.
Yeah.
So, the land devouring the people, that's
Exaggeration, hyperbole, I guess.
Bruce, you
Yeah.
know, all 12 saw the same thing,
That's right. But
but some teaching or faith was built in Joshua and Caleb where they were not.
that's right. Which is interesting because often you think people will argue that those who don't have faith, they're the ones following the facts, and the ones who do have faith, it's just a blind lead. This is the opposite of that. Those who have faith, that's been built on concrete deliverance that God has given to his people. Those who were living in distrust and unbelief of God were ignoring what God had done. So this isn't just believe it to believe it. This is believe it because this is who God is and this is what he has done for his people. And if he did it in the past, he'll do it again. Okay. All right. So it does seem to me that the point they're making is yeah, there's some great things there, but there's no point in going there because it's, we're just going to be devoured and overcome and consumed. I'll go back and look at that though, Alan. I think that's a worthy verse to consider. Okay, chapter 14, let's read verses 1 through 10. Richard, if you could just read those 10 verses for us. And then after that, Mike Binko, if you would go ahead and read verses 11 through 19. Let's go ahead and get this section out there, and then we'll move through it.
And how long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. And Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear it, for by your might you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land. And they have heard that you, Lord, are among these people, that you, Lord, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands above them. And you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day, and in a pillar of fire by night. Now if you kill these people as one man, then the nations which have heard of your fame will speak, saying, because the Lord was not able to bring this people to the land which he swore to give them, therefore he killed them in the wilderness. And now I pray, let the power of my Lord be great, just as you have spoken, saying, the Lord is long-suffering and abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But he by no means clears the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Pardon the iniquity of this people, I pray, according to the greatness of your mercy, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt, even until now.
Okay, thank you. So let's try to work through that first section fairly quickly. So when you look in chapter 14 and verse 1, the people, they're again, remember, they're crying loudly. They're lamenting. They again are murmuring. They're rebelling. They're revolting against God again. Again, this murmuring and complaining leading to the revolt and rebellion and even unbelief against God comes out. So they're weeping with sadness, and you can imagine throughout the night into the morning. And we talked about the grasshoppers language and that kind of thing. So this weeping, it's not, and we've talked a lot about this, so we won't belabor the point, but it's not some crying out to God for help. The weeping is grounded in this grumbling. And so the text indicates that they raised their voices, they wept, they murmured, and they desired to return to Egypt, which is just amazing on so many levels. They even go further when you look at 14 and verse 3, Numbers chapter 14 and verse 3, which we just read. Notice, why is the Lord, or why is Yahweh bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? Was that God's plan? No, not at all. It was a plan of deliverance, but there was the condition of trusting in the Lord. So basically, they would rather be slaves of a wicked nation than faithfully fight for God. That's the way cowardice looks. That's what it is. And so when you have difficult circumstances, that's when the faith is tested. So difficult circumstances can open up a door of opportunity to demonstrate faith and even grow in your faith, or it's an opportunity to show distrust and unbelief, and that's what we see from Israel. Now, going further, and we talked about this several weeks ago, but I want you again to see it. The Lord's judgment tends, especially in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, you'll see this a lot in the Pentateuch. Whatever the judgment is seems to match very well to what they were saying. So the issue is their unbelief. But notice, they're talking about dying in the wilderness. Well, they're going to die in the wilderness now because of their unbelief. That's not what God had desired. And you see that's what they talked about. They don't believe in God, so that's going to be the consequence. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, you might say. Then falling by the sword. Well, some of them are going to fall by the sword. That's right, but that would be on them. Their children becoming prey. Well, are their children going to die in the wilderness? No. We'll talk more about this, but are the children going to have to go through some hardship because of their parents? Yes, they are. He talks about them shepherding and hard work and difficulties and these circumstances. So it's not like this generation is going to get to go straight into the promised land. However, because they believe and trust in God, they will go into the promised land eventually. So we'll talk more about that. So their fears are fulfilled, but not because God doesn't love them, not because God is powerless. And that's almost there is the evil accusation in this. Why did he bring us here? Well, he brought you here because he's going to take you to the promised land. But the reason these things are going to occur is not because of the Lord's lack of faithfulness, but because of their distrust in God. And that's very important for us to recognize too. If I trust in God, God will always do exactly what he says. Are there some promises, many promises even, in which there are conditions attached to the fulfillment of that promise? Yes, salvation is one of them. That doesn't mean we earn anything. We don't deserve it or anything like that. But certainly there is a condition for us to walk by faith. So if you look at chapter 14 and 5, and you see it in 16, 4 through 6 as well, Moses and Aaron, here we go again. They fall on their faces of dismay. Remember, Moses has already said, God, just take me. You remember that one. Here we go again. So they're trying to lead them in the way of God. They're in dismay. They see the unfaithfulness of the people. Joshua and Caleb, just think. Caleb has said, hey, we can do this by the power of God and by the grace of God. And they're not going to be able to do it immediately. And they tear their clothes, which we know in the Old Testament was a sign of sadness and sorrow and repentance and that kind of thing. Joshua and Caleb tear their clothes. They're in grief at the assembly's rebellion. They plead with the people to act in faith rather than rebellion in 14, 6, and 7. They give this bad, evil report. Yeah, it's not only a good land, but they are actually arguing against a good God. So the good land becomes a description of this section, and I won't belabor this point. Look at chapter 14 and verse 10. So the Lord is going to have a meeting with them. And you'll notice in chapter 14, verse 10, then the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of meeting. We've been talking a lot. That's representative of the presence of God. We've talked a lot about the tabernacle and temple, and it's good that we got all that detail now that we know that. He says, then the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of meeting to all the sons of Israel. So manifestations of his power and his glory and his strength. And the Lord has full understanding of what he's doing and what they're doing. And it's interesting, Exodus 24:17 describes the glory of the Lord in a text about judgment as a devouring fire. Now that's kind of interesting in light of the fact that they had said this land will devour us. They should have been more concerned about God devouring them and God's holiness and God's righteousness. So the Lord intervenes to stop their wickedness against his leaders. They're ready to do away with the leadership here that God has put in place, which often happens with those who are rebelling against God. They can't necessarily get to God, so who do they go to? They go to those that he's put in positions of leadership, in this case with Moses. Notice chapter 14 and verse 11. What does God say? How long will this people spurn me? Does anybody have a different rendering of that in 14:11, or does everybody have that? Reject. That's a good one. Despise. That Hebrew word is a really strong word. So we've got despise, provoke. Okay, that's a good. So how long will they provoke me? How long will they despise me, reject me, disbelieve in me? You could even say, but it's got a sharp, edgy, rebellious context. How long will, but notice the next statement. How long will this people spurn me, and how long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I've performed in their midst? Now I want you to hang on to this because this foreshadows something really important in the New Testament. So this is interesting. This is what Israel did to God. Well, let's think through this for a minute. This is what Israel did to God when he had delivered them from Egypt. They are in the wilderness, but God wants them to go to the promised land and enjoy his blessings. So when Jesus comes to Israel and to the world, he is God manifest in the flesh. He is the deliverer, right? He's the Messiah. In a sense, they're in the wilderness. He's wanting to lead them to his blessings. And what do they do with him? Despite God working through him, despite his signs and his miraculous manifestations over and over and over, what do they do with Jesus? They do exactly what Israel did to the Lord back here, in this case, in Numbers. And the consequences are going to be eternal and grave. So do you see, as you're reading when you get the story in Numbers, all that is going to do is help us with the story as we come on and see Jesus. And there's all kinds of applications of that are very interesting. So that's the very attitude we see. They spurned him, they despised him, they treated him with contempt. Now this is why when Stephen, turn to Acts chapter 7, and this is, by the way, Stephen had already given this great history of Israel. Acts chapter 7. Let's read this, and this will all come together. But he gives this long defense, and he really gives a big, long history lesson here in Acts 7. He goes all the way back to Abraham. He talks about Moses. You'll notice in verse 37, this is Moses who said to the sons of Israel, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Now the prophet that would follow in the footsteps of Moses was going to be who? Jesus. Acts 3 makes that the case. He was going to be the Messiah. Look at verse 38. This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness together with the angel who was speaking to him on Mount Sinai, and who was with our fathers, and he received living oracles to pass to you. Our fathers were unwilling to be obedient to him, but repudiated him, and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. There it is. So, you know, if I don't know anything about the story in the Old Testament, you read that and you kind of take it for granted. But if you've read that story, if you've read through Numbers like we're doing right now, and then Stephen comes back, well, why does he bring all this up? Because they're doing the same thing, and he's going to say that. He goes on to talk about their idolatry, talks about Moloch. Let's come on down. He says in verse 44, our fathers had the tabernacle of testimony in the wilderness, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it according to the pattern which he had seen. He goes on to talk about God's mission for them, their responsibility. But come on with me to verse 51. You men who are stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears are always resisting the Holy Spirit. And listen to what he says. You are doing just as your fathers did. You're doing just what they did. Now, you couldn't hit any harder than that if you're Stephen. Now, he goes on to explain. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you have now become, you who received the laws ordained by angels and yet did not keep it. And it says when they heard this, they were cut to the quick. They began gnashing on him with their teeth. But look, you know, sometimes we go, well, history can be boring. No, history puts a whole narrative and context on this, and he pulls them right back and says, you're doing the same thing. And so what we're reading in Numbers has an application to us, because we could be just like this Israel. We could spurn and despise and reject the Lord. Now, when it talks about them rejecting the land, what are they really rejecting when they reject this promise? What? God. And God's promise. God's blessing. Fellowship with God. I mean, think about the lengths to which God has gone. Even the first 10 chapters, that's very meticulous for us. He's gone to such lengths as a holy God to be able to have relationship with them and fellowship with them. I mean, he's just gone to extensive lengths. And now to say we want to go back to Egypt after all of the deliverance. So this is not in later on in chapter 15, he'll talk about sins that are committed that aren't necessarily deliberate. You know, maybe it was out of rashness or ignorance or something like that. But this refers to a high-handed, intentional, deliberate, rebellious sin against God. Okay, I want to move on because we've covered some of this. All right, so look at chapter 14 and verse 12. Did I miss anybody? Did anybody have their hand up that I didn't see? Okay, all right. So look at 14:12. What does God say after verse 11, which we just referenced? What does God initially want to do or suggest he's going to do? What, you start over with Moses? That's right. If he delivered him from Egypt, he can sure start over if he wants to. So what he wants to do, he's just ready to be done with them. I'll just start over. I'll make a nation, and that nation will be mightier than them. And guess who he's not going to get rid of? Moses, because Moses has been faithful. Okay. So Moses does what at that juncture? Because you know, based on what Moses said before, you might be surprised he doesn't say, I think that's a really good idea, Lord. Let's do this again. What does he do? Go ahead, Daryl.
He negotiates.
Yeah.
I can't imagine dialogue with God on this level. It boggles my mind.
It does. You know, that's a good point that Daryl makes. We talked about this several weeks ago, but the relationship Moses and God had, because you still have God being in this holy state, and there's an area even Moses can't get into, but they do have a different relationship than, which also foreshadows Christ, I think, but they're able to have dialogue in this way. Now, some of the prophets dialogue with God, but this seems to be in its own place. And so Moses shows mercy and he offers intercession. You know, intercessions speak on somebody's behalf. But it's really interesting how Moses does it, because what he cannot do, he cannot go to God and say, I think you're being unfair. He couldn't do that. That wouldn't be right. So when he goes to God to ask for mercy for Israel, what's the basis of his plea?
You have the nations. Now that you what? That's one of them.
Other nations, how they will view God. And this is not the only time. Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9, he, almost as a representative of Israel, says, we've sinned, Israel's sinned, we've sinned. And he appeals to God for mercy. Israel doesn't deserve it. He appeals to God for mercy on the basis of God's graciousness and love, but also how God will be perceived by others. And so if you'll notice here, and to me it's a beautiful section, Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear of it. For by your strength you brought up this people from their midst, and they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land. They have heard that you, O Lord, are in the midst of the people. So there's this connection between God and his people. For you, O Lord, are seen eye to eye while your cloud stands over them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and in a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you slay the people as one man, when the nations who have heard of your fame will say, because the Lord could not bring this people into the land which he promised them by oath. So there's some failure. This is how they're going to look at it. God couldn't get it done. And so he says, if this happens, that's how they're going to see it. And he slaughtered them in the wilderness. He says, but now I pray, let the power of the Lord be great, just as you have declared. Now this is interesting, verses 18 and 19. Verse 18, the Lord is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness. That's the Hebrew word for faithful love, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But he will by no means clear the guilty. And what he means by that, that doesn't mean the guilty get off, without any consequences. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations. Pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your loving kindness, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. Okay, let's look at verses 18 and 19. What does he mean by visiting on them judgment up until the third and fourth generation? Anybody? What? Okay, consequences, yeah. Right. Yes. So I'm trying to see here. Hang on, give me just a minute. Okay, come to I have page 12, but it's chart 194. Let me do this. I can get us there. Yeah, there it is. Okay, let's look here. So, God is clear in Deuteronomy and other passages that Actually, it's 24:16. Deuteronomy 24:16 says, fathers shall not be put to death for their sons, nor shall sons be put to death for their fathers. Everyone shall be put to death for his own sin. Okay. And there he's talking about Israel putting somebody to death. Okay. Now you might think about Achan, but the family was complicit in the story of Achan. We could talk about that sometime, but they weren't completely innocent in that. But what I would say, there's a couple of things to notice back here in Numbers chapter 14 that I think are important. Number one, there are consequences, but it's limited compared to his mercy. Come back to Numbers chapter 14. Look at the contrast going on. In Numbers chapter 14, he says that God is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children of the third and fourth generations. But then he says, pardon, I say, the iniquity of this people. So there's plenty of passages that talk about, thousands of generations being benefited by God's mercy. Here's my point to you. I don't think he's saying that somehow he holds them as guilty in the sense of there's too many passages as far as eternity is concerned. It is interesting from the reading I did, many homes and families were made up of 3 to 4 generations among the Israelites. So I think what he's saying, I believe what he's saying here, and there's other passages like this, is simply this, and that is that God brings consequences, and that the consequences of one generation often bleed over into a number of generations. And so it's not that they're necessarily spiritually lost, but there's consequences they're having to undergo. And even this second generation is going to have to go through some consequences and some difficulty in these wanderings because of the first generation. Now, they're going to also get to go to the promised land, and there's going to be some benefit. But here's the point, and we'll end it right here. We need to understand, you see this in David's household as well, but we need to understand with sin, it's not that I alone will have to deal with the consequences of my sin. Now, spiritually, that's true. But there are sins we commit. It's going to impact your marriage. It's going to impact your children. It's going to impact your grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So the notion that we do this in a vacuum, or we act in this way in a vacuum and it doesn't impact anybody else, that's never taught in Scripture. Now, your soul, that's a different matter. But the consequences of decisions we make and the ways in which we act, clearly, he says God will visit 3 and 4 generations in the Old Testament because it's just the natural result of the order of things. Okay, we'll stop right there.